Most people that appear as guests on podcasts believe that their appearance is going to turn into clients, but most of the time they don't. And part of the reason is not because of what they do on the podcast, but most of the time it's based off of what they did before the podcast. If you're new to the channel, I'm Devin Rodriguez, founder of PodcastGuest.io, and we've worked with over 300 of the highest level business owners and not only have gotten them booked on podcasts, but more importantly, helped them turn those conversations into conversions. So what most people think is that when they go on podcasts, they just magically think that, and watch this, you're going to be thoroughly impressed with my eyeballs that I'm about to draw here, okay? Boop. They just think that when they get in front of people, they get in front of eyeballs, they just think that immediately it's going to turn into a conversion. So what I consistently see is that people have this big misconception that if they just go on podcast, money's going to fall from the sky and they're going to be so rich. So they just go on podcast, talk, speak, tell their story, talk about their business. And then what ends up happening is that unfortunately, most people end up very sad. Why? Because their conversation that they had did not turn into conversions. And it's not so much of what they do when they actually go on the podcast itself. A lot of it has to do with what the person either did or did not do before the podcast. So what I really want to talk about today is how do we master the art of preparing for your podcast interview? Because here's the thing. When I was in the military, we had this quote that if you fail to prepare, you better prepare to fail. But for some reason, when people go on podcasts, they just look at it like this thing where
I just show up and I just speak and I tell my story.
But that can't be the furthest thing from truth. And I'm just going to share a quick story with you. A couple of years ago, I gave a TEDx talk. One of our clients and one of my mentors, Les Brown, he called me up the day before I gave my TEDx talk, literally 12 hours before the actual presentation. And what happened was I had sent him a recording of like a mock talk that I did, and I asked him to review it for me. And he called me up 12 hours before. I had sent him this footage of me speaking, practicing my talk 2 weeks before the actual presentation was going to happen. But here he is 12 hours before. I'm driving a good old Outback Steakhouse. And he says, Devin, I said, yes, sir. He says, what you sent me, that video, he says, that is not it. I said, what do you mean that's not it? He says, Devin, you have to understand that what you shared in that video, he says, that is the message that you want to share. But the message that you want to share oftentimes is not the message that that audience needs to hear. And it was at that moment that I realized that most people, whether they speak on a stage, whether they appear as guests on podcasts, they just go on and speak about whatever they want to speak about, but they do not contextualize the conversation to that specific audience. So the first key part of preparing for your podcast interview is you really need to study the audience. So what does that mean? You need to become intimately familiar with a couple of different things. Number one, what is the theme of that podcast? For example, my podcast is called the 7-Figure Mentor Podcast. So if you were to come on my podcast, well, guess what everybody in the audience is looking to do? Get to the 7-figure mark. So therefore, when you come on and you share your message and articulate what it is that you do, you need to do so in a way where you are customizing and contextualizing your message to that specific audience. Because remember, there's a big difference between what you want to share and what that audience needs to hear. So what you want to do is you first want to go, and you can go and check this out somewhere on like Apple Podcast, or you can go on Spotify, and you'll notice that each of these platforms will have the description of the podcast. And it's typically towards the top or somewhere, and you can click read more, and it'll give you a full breakdown of exactly what the theme of the podcast is. So you first want to make sure that you study the theme. Second thing that you do is you want to listen to 1 or 2 episodes of the podcast. And what I typically recommend is if you're someone like me and you're a busy business owner, you don't have all day, put it on 2x speed. Why are you doing that? Well, because you want to get familiar with the host. You want to get familiar how they ask questions, the tempo of the interview, the type of guest that they've had in the past, etc. But more importantly, the reason why you want to listen to the podcast is what I tell people is you want to make sure that you specifically focus on the bookends. So in other words, you want to make sure that you specifically focus on how does that podcast host begin the interview and how do they end the interview? Because what you'll begin to identify is that most podcast hosts start their podcast in the same exact way. Why is that important? Well, because if you truly want to master the art of being a guest on podcast, understanding how a podcast host consistently opens their podcast allows you the opportunity to craft how you are going to answer the first question that they are going to ask. Now, hint, usually that question is always the same. I would say about 75% of the time, it's going to be something that's going to be related to your story. So how did you get here? That type of stuff. We actually have an entire training that we've done on this channel where I break down how to properly introduce yourself. It'll be right up above this video somewhere over here. Now, that's the first thing you want to do is you want to check how they start the interview. But also, here's the thing. Typically, how they end the interview is also the same. Why is that so important? Well, because at the end of the podcast, you want to make sure that you're able to what we call bake your CTA. In other words, you want to be able to bake your offer within a call to action. But if you go on a podcast and you have absolutely no idea how they end that podcast, do you even know if they give you the opportunity to pitch your offer, to give away your gift, whatever it is that you're specific? We also have a training on the channel about how to create this offer so that it's actually something that people take action on. That's a different conversation. But what you want to do is you want to see, okay, how does that person, some people will say,
hey, where can people follow you? Do you have something that you can give the audience? What should you do specifically?
So with that being said, you want to make sure you study that so that you can adequately prepare for that. So now you see how just by studying the audience, but also studying the podcast, what's happening is you're becoming much more proactive. Where now, since we studied the theme of the podcast, you know specifically the type of people that listen to the show. So what ends up happening is you're able to contextualize and customize your message to that audience. But also now you've studied how the podcast host starts and ends the episode so you can adequately prepare for that. Now, this is very proactive. This is like the difference between somebody going to the gym and not getting any results, which is most people that go to the gym, and the guy or the girl or the man or woman that goes to the gym and you see them make a radical transformation in their body within a short amount of time. It's not because the vehicle was different, the gym. It was because of how they prepared themselves before they got to the gym. So step number one is to really make sure that you study the audience and study the podcast, because without this, I'm telling you right now, this is going to cost you so much money. You're leaving so much on the table because you're not doing the very basic fundamentals. This is like the chest pass. This is like a dribble. This is like Michael Jordan before he started any practice would do chest passes. Why? Because those were the fundamentals that allowed him to do all of the high level things easily. First, you need to master the fundamentals. So just to put a bow on this, make sure that you're studying the audience. Ask yourself the question, who are these people? Where are they in their journey? What's the theme of the podcast? Because the theme is going to be the thing that attracts a certain type of individual. And then you want to make sure that you listen to the podcast so that you clearly understand what the podcast asks, the theme of it, how does he ask questions, how much time does he typically give people to speak, but also making sure that at the bare minimum, you take a look at the bookends. How do they start? How do they end? Because that's going to help you customize how you approach each and every one of those situations. Okay, so the second thing you want to do is now that you studied the audience and you studied the podcast, number two, you want to make sure that you study the host. Why? This is always what I tell people. Whenever you go on a podcast, you're trying to reach this person over here. This is somebody that exists in the audience. I'm going to give him some hair today because I'm feeling generous. Hell, we'll even give him some ears. Okay, I know you're thoroughly impressed with my drawings. So with that being said, you're trying to reach this person over here. This is your ideal client. And here you are over here. Well, the thing is that in between you and your ideal client, well, guess who exists? The podcast host. So in other words, the host is the facilitator between you and your ideal client. So therefore, it behooves you to do everything in your ability to build as much rapport, as much trust with that podcast host. But what do most people do when they go on podcasts? They don't know jack, you know what, about this host. They don't do any research. They don't study the host. They don't know what's going on in the host's life. Why? Because they're selfish. And actually, they look at it like, screw the host. I just want to speak to my ideal client. But actually, by not focusing on the host, they're missing out on the entire point of the conversation, because the host is the beacon of facilitation between the message you have and the ideal client that you're looking to reach. So what most podcast hosts are used to is a podcast guest coming on that knows absolutely jack all about them. They don't know who they are, what they do, their background, what's going on in their life. And that's what they're used to. But if you're watching this right now, the one thing that I know is that you don't want to just be like everybody else. You want to be the person that stands out. You want to be the person that has the highest likelihood of taking this person who's the ideal client and converting that person into some type of business, into your client. The biggest part to that is understanding that the host can be one of two things. They can either be number one, your greatest promoter, or number two, they can be your greatest detractor. And if you just show up like everybody else, chances are they're going to be a detractor. You want to be able to turn the host into an active promoter. Let me give you an example. I had a client of mine named Holly Bertone. She's a former chief of staff of the FBI. And lo and behold, she listened to us. And prior to going on to the podcast, she studied the host. She went to their social media channels, see what's going on in their life. Noticed that she recently had a baby. She went on the podcast, and before the podcast started, typically you'll have like a pre-podcast chat where you guys will get to know each other for a few minutes, etc. Well, guess what? When she was talking to that host, she was able to contextualize the conversation based off of what was going on in that person's life. Now, with that being said, guess what ended up happening? After the podcast, the host did something that they never do. They actively promoted Holly on their social media with thousands of Instagram followers after the interview. Most of the time, they wait until the interview is published, but now they did it as soon as the interview was over. Why? Because Holly differentiated herself and she turned the host into a promoter. Guess what ended up happening? Holly got 50 plus leads immediately, just as a result of contextualizing the conversation with the podcast host. So what's the practicality of this? How do you actually do this? First thing you want to do is you're going to make sure that you go check them out on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and what you're specifically looking for, what life events are these people having? Because now if I go on a podcast and I say, hey man, I saw you recently got married. I just wanted to congratulate. I saw you recently traveled. I saw you recently did this thing. Contextualizes the conversation. And context leads to people feeling special. It leads to people feeling like you actually pay attention. Like you're in it not just for what you can get out of it. You're actually in it to get to know the person. And immediately you differentiate yourself. What you want to do is you also want to research if they've been a guest on podcast. And you want to listen to maybe a couple of minutes of an episode that they've been on. Once again, put it on 2x speed and listen for 10 minutes. And then guess what you can do is, hey man, hey chick, I saw you on XYZ podcast where you specifically talked about blank, blank, blank. That was an absolutely incredible episode. Makes them feel special. And why is all of this so important? Reciprocity. Meaning when you do something for somebody, when you make somebody else feel special, they are naturally, subconsciously going to do everything in their ability to make you feel special. So by you studying the host, checking in what's going on in their life, being able to see what podcasts they have been on, it allows you to contextualize and customize the conversation that you have with the host so that you can take them just from merely being a host to being somebody that becomes a promoter. Somebody that actually wants you, I don't even know if I'm spelling it, promoter. I think that's right. To somebody that actively wants to see you win. So now they're going to do everything in their ability to help you win. So studying the host is one of the most fundamental things that you need to do so that you can contextualize that conversation, which is ultimately going to lead to helping you convert your ideal client at the highest level. Because remember, the podcast is the middleman. They're the person that's a facilitator between your message and their ears. So therefore, it behooves you to do everything in your ability to make sure that you build as much trust and rapport with that person so that they can facilitate that conversion as best as they can. Hey, listen, before we continue the video, if you're a business owner and you want to scale your business and you want to build your brand, and you know that being a guest on podcast is going to be a vehicle for you to get in front of more qualified leads, we would love to support you on that journey. Down below, you'll see a link to speak to the team where we can show you exactly how we will get you placed on some of the top podcasts in your specific industry so you can begin generating more qualified calls. So just tap the link below and we'll get you squared away. Let's get back to the video. Okay, so the third thing you want to do is very important, is that before you go on the podcast, you want to make sure that you leave a rating and a review. Why do you want to do that? Well, here's the thing. Podcast hosts, whether they want to admit it or not, and why can I speak on this? Because I'm a damn podcast host. So I could do whatever I want. I could talk about it because I'm one of them, all right? I'm just kidding, not really. They're all driven by their ego. Part of the reason why they created the podcast in the first place is somewhere deep down inside, they want to feel noticed. They want to feel like they have attention. They want to feel like the message that they're sharing is ultimately getting out into the world and impacting people. And that is definitely something that's driven by ego. And with that being said, ratings and reviews are two things that every podcast host absolutely loves. So the reason why, by the way, is because it makes them feel some type of significance. It's a status symbol.
I got 500 reviews. Badass.
Okay, now here's the thing. I don't even think the ratings and reviews actually do anything in terms of searchability, discoverability, the algorithms on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, but it don't matter because ultimately what it does is it makes the host feel special. It makes them feel some sense of status. So with that being said, what you want to do is you want to go to Spotify. The thing with Spotify is that it makes you listen to an entire episode before you can leave a rating. But just do that, okay? Just do that because it builds upon what it is that we're talking about before. Don't be the guy or the girl that just goes and fast forwards through the episode and then just leaves a 5-star rating. Don't do that. Now, Spotify only allows you to leave ratings. So it allows you to just click a button and click how many stars. But on Apple Podcast, you want to make sure that you scroll down. If you're doing it on mobile, you'll just scroll down and then it'll allow you to leave both a rating and a review where you write a really nice blurb about the podcast host. Make sure that it's contextual. Don't just put some garbage on there. I like to specifically say something along the lines of, this is one of the best podcasts that I've recently come across specifically for this type of person who's looking to do this specific thing. And then what you want to do is at the bottom of it is you want to make sure that you put like a dash and put your name. So you put Devin Rodriguez as an example. Why? So that the podcast host can see that it was you. Okay. So now, once again, what does that do? That builds more trust and more rapport. But also in one of the trainings where we talk specifically about how to introduce yourself on a podcast, part of what we do is we encourage the audience to also leave a rating and review. And what we say is, I just left mine a couple of days ago. So you'll see mine over there. So immediately the host is like, wow, you left a rating and review on my podcast and you're promoting the audience to do the same. Man, I love you. It's going to make them feel special. Once again, reciprocity. So leave a rating and review. Typically you want to do this 48 hours before the podcast. Part of the reason is because if you do it on Apple Podcasts, it takes a couple of days for it to populate. So just do it 48 hours before. Okay, fourth thing is going to be super simple. You want to make sure that you have all of the logistics pre-planned, meaning specifically, you want to make sure that you have a couple of things. If you're a Google Calendar guy like I am, you want to make sure that it's clearly marked on your Google Calendar because there's nothing worse than you supposed to be on a podcast and then you miss it because it's simply not on your calendar. So easy solution to that is just to make sure that when you book it, make sure you directly go to your Google Calendar to confirm, that is a really bad check mark, that it is on the calendar. If it's not, you want to make sure that you add it there. Or you message the host and say, hey, can you send me a calendar invite? On the other end of the equation, and this is the one that I see screw people up a lot, is that you want to make sure that you have the link to the podcast episode. Now you might be thinking, Devin, this is common sense. Well, as somebody that has worked with hundreds of people and booked thousands of podcasts, why do you think that I have this on here? Because sometimes
common sense ain't so common.
Okay, so you want to make sure that when you book it, that the link is sent to you. Now, here's the thing. Sometimes people will not send you the link before like a day before the podcast or something. Be proactive. Make sure that you know that. Make sure that you set a reminder of that. Why? So that you can follow up with that host to make sure that they're giving you what it is that you need. The last thing you want is 5 minutes before an episode, you go click on that Google Calendar invite and you don't see the link. You're going to be freaking out. You're going to be doing all these crazy things.
Oh my God, where's the link?
And you're going to be trying to find their social media, send them DMs, email them, do it. So do yourself a favor for your own sake. Just confirm you have the link when you book it. And if you don't, follow up with that host until you get it. Super simple, but I can't tell you how many times I've seen people do this. They don't have the link and then it drives them crazy. And then even if they find the link, guess what? Now your cortisol has risen. Now you're not thinking properly. Now it's negatively influenced your appearance. So this might sound super simple to you, but I'm telling you, these are two of the things that I've seen consistently screw people over and has actually stopped them from monetizing their appearance and had nothing to do with their actual appearance, but the fact that they didn't have the logistics in place to be able to be successful. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk to you about is simply check your environment, okay? Check and control your environment. What do I mean by this? Well, it's very simple. You want to make sure, and this is really important. Like some of these are basics, right? Some of these are basics, but why do you think I cover them? Because I've seen it ruin so many people's appearances. First things first, you want to make sure that if you're using Zoom, which once again, you will know based upon the link, you want to make sure that you have the correct settings on Zoom. So with that being said, you want to make sure that you have the button checked where it specifically states background noise, eliminator, or something along the lines of that it says, there's like a box. How much do you want to filter out background noise? Just put it on high. I think it's like low, medium, high. Put it on high because guess what? If your dog starts to bark or if somebody's knocking on your door super loud, or if your family is talking, whatever, you have to understand podcasts primarily are an audio-based platform. So therefore, we need to optimize for the audio-based experience. So make sure that you have that correctly put on, okay? So number one, the audio filter on Zoom, make sure that that's on. If you're on a platform like Riverside, there should be something called echo cancellation. Click that on. You should be able to do that. Also, number two, with that being said, when it comes to checking your environment, and Zoom is you want to make sure that you have a nice background, professional looking background. Don't do it in like your bedroom with the sheets crazy, doing all of these crazy things. If you do not have a good environment to film in, what you want to make sure is on Zoom, you put on the blurred background. Okay, put on blur. I do not like, let me make sure I stress that again, the graphic backgrounds where it's like clearly a fake background or you put like a virtual background or something. Those are corny. But also, guess what? If you want to repurpose that content, put it into clips, it's going to ruin the quality of that video. So do yourself a favor and don't do that. Just blur your background. But easiest solution is to just have a decent looking backdrop. It could just be a wall, but don't have some crazy stuff in your background. Once again, I've seen some pretty damn crazy things in my day. Now, other thing when it comes to checking and controlling your environment is if you have other people in the house, you want to make sure that you let them know that you have a podcast. Hey, I have a podcast coming up. Just please, for the next hour, just please keep it down just so I can focus. Why? Because I've seen people talking, the background noise, all of these different things. So let people know, okay? Number 3, very simple stuff here is if you have pets, you want to make sure that you put them in other rooms because if your dog comes up licking you during the middle of the episode, sure, it's going to be cute. The host is going to smile, but that distracts you. So little things like controlling your environment, making sure that your desk is clean, things like that have such a big influence on your performance on the podcast. Now, when it comes to your environment as well, I typically recommend you want a pretty decent tech setup. So you want to have a good mic. A really good mic that I like is something that I call the Samson Q2U, which is, I think they just raised the price to like $99 or something like that. It's about $100. Or if you want to get one like I'm recording on right now, this is a Shure mic. They have, I forgot the name of it specifically, but they sell one that's a USB-C. It just plugs right into the computer. This one that I'm using, you have to plug it into all of this fancy stuff. There's like an additional cost with it. I wouldn't really recommend that. I think the one that I'm talking about, I think it's $249. Well worth the money. Why? Because once again, podcasts are primarily audio based. So you want to make sure that you have that dialed in. Also, I would recommend that you get a 4K camera. Now, I don't mean like a DSLR $2,000 camera. Just get like a webcam. Go look up Logitech 4K camera, spend $200. Why? Because now, number one, if you want to repurpose the content, you at least want it to look decent. Also, I will say that the Mac internal camera is pretty damn good. So you could honestly probably rock with that if you have it. I would just make sure that if you have a microfiber cloth, just clean over the camera before you get started. But I would just pick up a Logitech if you don't have a Mac specific computer. Like I have a Lenovo at home. I don't really like it. It looks like super blurry. It's not good. Maybe because it's a little old, but anyways, just make sure that the camera quality actually looks decent. Okay. Now, last thing that I want to tell you on this note, number 6, and this is a really big one, is you want to make sure that you get the raw footage from the podcast. Why? Because sometimes a podcast might not come out for 90 days, 120 days plus. And part of the thing that is most important when it comes to these podcasts is going to be how you can repurpose and what we call create a content distribution system from the footage from these podcasts, from the content. Because that's really the thing that will allow you to amplify and multiply the impact that these shows are having on your business. But guess what? If you don't have the damn footage, you can't do that. So on the podcast in and of itself, and this is more so of like preparing to say this, remembering to do this, is you want to ask the host, hey host, would you mind just sending me the raw footage of our podcast here today after the interview? I just want to be able to send it to my content team so that we can create content so that we'll be able to promote the episode. That's it. Always frame it in their best interest and try to get that raw footage and try to get them to send it to you as soon as possible. So make sure you're very specific in your language. Would you be able to send me over today the footage from this podcast so that I can send it to my content team to create content that I can help promote your episode and your podcast? I'm going to tell all my followers, email lists, etc., to leave you a 5-star rating and review. They're more than likely going to say yes. But you want to do this specifically at the end of the episode. You don't want to do it before the episode, just so you guys can continue to build more trust and rapport throughout the episode. So this is how you really prepare for your podcast appearances. And if you ultimately want to bring in the dollars and you want to convert on podcasts, you need to make sure that you're preparing for these podcasts properly, because proper preparation will lead to conversion.